It was supposed to be just another day. A man in a crisp suit, briefcase in hand, walks confidently down a bustling city street. He's a respected lawyer, known for his work defending those who've been wronged. But what happens next is something no one could have anticipated. Out of nowhere, police cars screech to a halt, and officers rush toward him. Confused but calm, he raises his hands, trying to ask what's going on. Instead of answers, he's met with handcuffs. The officers accuse him of a crime he didn't commit, their tone laced with assumptions based solely on how he looks. Passers-by gather, murmuring and filming the scene. As the lawyer is forced into the back of the police car, he remains quiet, his mind racing. Should he reveal who he is now, or wait? He knows the truth will come out, but he also knows this moment holds a mirror to a bigger issue, one many try to ignore. Inside the station, when the officers begin processing him, his true identity is revealed. What happens next leaves everyone in the room stunned, forcing them to confront their biases in a way they never expected. Stay tuned to see how this story unfolds. The tension in the station was palpable. Officers glanced at each other, their confident demeanor beginning to waver as they sifted through the man's belongings. His wallet, his ID, even his business cards told a story that didn't match the assumptions they had made. They had expected a criminal, someone who fit the description of a suspect they were chasing. Instead, they found themselves face to face with a highly successful defense attorney, a man who had spent years fighting for justice in a system that often failed people who looked like him. But how did it come to this? Just hours earlier, the lawyer had been wrapping up a meeting with a client, a young man wrongfully accused of theft. It wasn't the first case like this he'd taken on, but each one left a mark. He knew all too well how racial profiling could turn lives upside down, and he had dedicated his career to exposing it. As he sat in the holding room, the lawyer replayed the arrest in his mind. The officers hadn't even asked for an explanation. Their questions were laced with suspicion, their words sharp. It wasn't about what he had done, it was about what they thought he represented. Outside the station, the videos taken by bystanders had already started to spread online. Comments poured in, some outraged, others questioning. Inside, the lawyer remained composed, knowing that the real confrontation was about to begin. The lawyer sat in silence, his calm demeanor masking the storm brewing inside him. He'd faced discrimination before, but this felt different. This wasn't just about him. It was about every client he'd ever represented, every young person he'd seen trapped in a system that judged them before the facts were known. In the next room, the officers huddled together, reviewing the evidence. Their earlier confidence was unraveling as they realized the man they had just arrested wasn't a suspect at all. One officer, visibly uncomfortable, muttered, "We might have jumped the gun on this one." Another, more defensive, insisted he matched the description. What were we supposed to do? The tension between them was as thick as the unease spreading through the station. Meanwhile, the lawyer's phone, confiscated during the arrest, buzzed incessantly in an evidence bag. His assistant had noticed his absence and was trying to reach him. She had seen the viral video and was already working to contact the media. The lawyer wasn't just another face in the crowd. He was a name people recognized, a figure respected in the legal community. Across the city, social media erupted with debates. Some were outraged, calling out the racial bias so glaringly obvious. Others, skeptical, asked, why didn't he just tell them who he was? The truth was, he shouldn't have had to. The tension wasn't just in the station anymore, it was everywhere. Back in the holding room, the lawyer leaned forward, staring at the door. He knew it would open soon, but he wasn't sure what would be waiting on the other side. The door finally creaked open, and one of the officers stepped inside. His expression was conflicted, shifting between authority and unease. The lawyer raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, waiting. The officer hesitated before clearing his throat. "We're reviewing things. Just sit tight," he said before quickly leaving the room. The lawyer smirked slightly, recognizing the cracks in their facade. They were scrambling, and he knew it. Outside, the station's lobby was beginning to fill. Reporters, tipped off by the lawyer's assistant, had arrived with cameras and microphones. A few community leaders and activists had also shown up, demanding answers. The officers behind the desk looked increasingly nervous as they tried to maintain control of the growing crowd. Inside the station, the commanding officer was now involved, pacing back and forth as he questioned his team. "You're telling me you arrested a prominent attorney without cause. Do you have any idea what kind of firestorm this is about to cause?" he barked. The younger officers shifted uncomfortably, one mumbling, "He matched the description, we thought." But their excuses sounded weaker with every word. In the holding room, the lawyer could hear the commotion building outside. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. This wasn't just about his own freedom. It was a moment that could expose the very system he had been fighting against for years. But what would happen next? Would the truth finally force accountability, or would they try to bury it once again? As the commotion outside grew louder, the lawyer's assistant pushed through the crowd, her determined voice cutting through the chaos. "I need to see him," she demanded, waving her ID at the officers blocking the entrance. They hesitated, unsure how to handle the situation. Just then, a reporter shouted, "Is it true you arrested a prominent black attorney? Do you have a comment on the racial profiling allegations?" Cameras zoomed in, capturing every nervous glance exchanged by the officers. Inside, the commanding officer leaned against the wall, his face lined with stress. "We can't afford this kind of exposure," he muttered, his voice low but tense. Then came the second shock. A knock at the door interrupted their discussion. An officer stepped in, pale and visibly shaken, holding a tablet. "Sir, we just got word. The actual suspect was apprehended 2 miles from here. He confessed. He's in custody now." The room fell silent. The weight of their mistake hit hard, but the commanding officer's response was chilling. "We clean this up quietly," he said, his tone firm. "No statements, no apologies. Process him, release him, and let it blow over." Back in the holding room, the lawyer was deep in thought when another officer entered, avoiding eye contact. "You're free to go," he said, unlocking the cuffs with shaky hands. But the lawyer didn't move. Instead, he looked up, his eyes piercing. "You think this ends here?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with resolve. The officer froze, sensing that this was far from over. The lawyer stood slowly, brushing off his sleeves as the officer stepped back, clearly uneasy. "I'll leave," the lawyer said, his voice steady. "But not before I have a word with your commanding officer." The officer hesitated, but, seeing no other option, nodded and led him down the hallway. As they walked, the lawyer could hear the muffled sounds of protests from outside. He knew this wasn't just about him anymore. It had become a symbol of something much larger. When they entered the office, the commanding officer straightened, his expression carefully blank. "You're free to go," he said curtly, avoiding the lawyer's eyes. "There was a misunderstanding." The lawyer let out a dry laugh. "A misunderstanding? That's what you're calling this?" He leaned forward, locking eyes with the officer. "You knew I wasn't your suspect hours ago, but you kept me here anyway. Now you want to sweep it under the rug. Do you really think that's going to work?" Before the officer could respond, there was a knock at the door. Another officer entered, holding a phone. "Sir, it's the mayor's office. They've seen the footage," he said, his voice tight with panic. The commanding officer's face fell as he grabbed the phone, stepping aside to take the call. The lawyer stood there, watching the unraveling in real time. But just as he was about to leave, his assistant burst into the room, holding up her phone. "They're live streaming from outside," she said, showing him the screen. The crowd had grown, and a local news anchor was reporting that this wasn't the first complaint of racial profiling against this precinct. The lawyer turned back to the commanding officer, who had just finished his call. The man's face was pale, his confidence shattered. "This isn't over," the lawyer said, his voice calm but firm. "Not for me, and not for anyone else who's been through this." Then, with the cameras outside rolling and the world watching, he walked out of the station, leaving the system to face the weight of its own reckoning. But as the lawyer stepped into the crowd, his phone buzzed with an anonymous message. Asterisk, be careful. You've made powerful enemies. Asterisk, he glanced around, scanning the faces, the weight of the warning settling in. The fight wasn't over, it was just beginning. As the lawyer stepped into the crowd, he was met with applause and chants demanding justice. His assistant stood by his side, holding his briefcase as reporters shouted questions. He paused, turning to face the cameras. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice clear and steady. "It's about a system that needs to change. No one should be judged by the color of their skin before the facts are known. This stops now." The video of his statement went viral within hours, sparking national conversations about accountability and reform. Lawsuits were filed against the precinct, and investigations into their practices began. The lawyer's determination became a rallying point, inspiring others to speak out about their own experiences. But as he walked away from the chaos that night, his phone buzzed again with another anonymous warning. He took a deep breath, knowing the fight ahead would be long. Still, he smiled faintly, fueled by the belief that change, though slow, was possible. For him, this was more than a personal victory. It was a step toward justice for everyone who had been wronged.